Okay, typographic expressionism. So this is just like a little intro to basically set up the project that we're gonna work on in class. There will not be a quiz. Okay, so section 1, things that are made or cut: drawings, lettering, found type, and collage. So this is going to be kind of all across the board. Like there's probably work from the 60s in here, and then there's work from like yesterday. So this is some work by a German studio called Hort, who they do a lot of different things, but they're definitely known for a kind of open-ended experimental approach to design. So these are t-shirt graphics for the LeBron James brand at Nike. And one of the things that I find really interesting about Hort is that, as far as I can tell, part of their practice is just to generate form, so that like when they're working on a project, they're exploring it in lots of different media and trying lots of different things. They're not necessarily making like brand strategy boards and then being like, what should LeBron look like this year, and sort of comparing it to everything else. They're a bit more organic, and they're sort of like, what do we feel like saying about LeBron? And then Maren has seen this stuff already in the last week. This is a restaurant interiors by Neasden Control Centre. Neasden works in kind of a similar fashion as Hort, though they're decidedly less corporate. They look like they just sort of do whatever they please, and then make a kind of visual image out of that. So this identity for this restaurant called Hardisty, it's just all of this sort of drawing and collaging, and really the only unifying thread is basically that it's typography and that it's black and white. And otherwise, it's like one section of the restaurant is a bunch of drawings of A's, and another section is just, who knows? Like, I don't know if W722 means anything to anyone, or if it was just something somebody felt like making. And then this is some of that same work at a more close-up view. So their menu is, again, like just this pile of drawn A's. Even when there's like set type in this, it looks like it might be letter set or rub down lettering that kind of rots as you use it. An ad that's basically just a collage of lots of different stuff. And if Neasden stuff like looks familiar to anyone in a way, like, oh, that looks like a lot of stuff I see. That's because like Neasden has been at this since the 1990s to probably not enough acclaim. This is a book cover by them. I have a feeling in this one, maybe the art director at whatever publisher this is was like, can you give us something that looks like one of those paintings that you make? But this very kind of cut paper, drawn with a fat marker aesthetic. These are lecture flyers by Ed Fella. I don't know, is anybody familiar with Ed Fella? Ed Fella is the best. There's a Walker lecture, like an Insights lecture from a couple of years ago that's online. He's a super interesting character. He basically worked as a very kind of buttoned up corporate designer in Detroit from the time he got out of college till he was, whatever it is, age it is you retire when you're in the auto union, like 52 or whatever, or 48. And then he became probably like one of the most well-known sort of experimental graphic designers in the world. Like he retired, went to grad school, teaches at Cal Arts now. But part of his practice, the only thing he really makes is flyers for his own lectures, and they're never given out in advance. So when like if you go see him lecture, after the lecture's over, he hands out a bunch of flyers for it. And so this is one of them. One of the things that's really interesting is he's this kind of relentless experimenter. So it's sort of like well known that if you're ever sitting in a room with Ed Fella, he's sitting there with a sketchbook open, like drawing the whole time, even as he's like talking to you. And a lot of it is these sort of typographic things. And just within the range of this one page, you can see all the sort of different ideas that are happening, like things that look like they could be drawings from signs, to this sort of funny scripty stuff, to just these weird little studies that could be E's or W's or something, and sort of like white out textures. And then up in here, I wish that we could really see in here, but there's just this crazy dense typographic cloud. The funny thing too is he actually like, he makes everything as if it's real. Like it's all got like return mailing addresses and whatnot. And these are a few more of these flyers. If you go to his website, I mean, there's probably hundreds of these things. It's like his main sort of artistic practice. And you can just see that, like, again, this sort of range of typographic experimentation and just sort of doodling and then like turning that into stuff. These are some collages that he does. So he does these typographic collages where it just takes found imagery, and then like in this one he's sort of compacting them so that like they look like type, but they don't look like type, right? Like they're not readable at all. One of the things that is so fascinating about Ed is that he just, he's exploring sort of constantly. Like if you ever are lucky enough to get like a piece of mail from him, there's like a photocopy of a gravestone rubbing in it or something like that, or like a study of a bunch of like type from like manhole covers and things like that. It's pretty fantastic. So section 2, shot or captured. So this is all stuff that involves photography, still life, projection, or image capture. So this first one is a quote about a project called the Photocopier by Mitch Goldstein. And so Mitch says about this project, as a tool of making, the humble photocopier can do many surprising things. These explorations all stem from a single piece of paper, the first page of my syllabus for the electronic media and culture class at MICA. The only effect has been to use the positive-negative function. So basically, like, you know, you can hit negative and it will make all the white black and all the black white. And so Mitch does a lot of these sort of open-ended explorations for no real reason, just to see what will happen so that later he's got this kind of archive of ideas for projects. And obviously they end up being very typographic because they start with type that was like never intended to be turned into this big bold thing. But as he's like moving the paper around too, he's like generating these other forms that also start to feel like type, which is really interesting. And then this is some of his actual work. So this is a poster for a James Victor lecture, or Victori, I don't know how to pronounce his name. And basically it was assembled, he made all this stuff and then just built it all on the flatbed of a scanner. And so you can see like the sort of crazy lines that kind of build up from it. And then Mitch has a company called Hypothesis with his wife, Ann Jordan. This is some work they've done for the Illumination Engineering Society Awards. It's no surprising maybe that lighting engineers are really excited about the work of these designers that work really heavily with cameras. And so they'll do a lot of stuff like, I believe the reason that this is kind of peachish is because he's holding his hands in front of the camera and trying to like mess with it. So a lot of their process involves setting up something based on a hunch, like this could be interesting, and then just shooting and trying lots of stuff. And then they'll go back through the photography, looking for things that are promising, and then sort of build off from there, which is also interesting because that's like so opposed to this sort of traditional, like either problem solving method of graphic design where it's like, you have to know what you're going to do before you do it, or the sort of brand positioning way of doing graphic design where you stake out a very kind of safe place that you're going to wind up. Theirs is more like, we're going to try this thing and hopefully it's going to work. And this is a book cover also by Hypothesis, kind of same idea, they're projecting type onto these surfaces. And you get these just like wonderful kind of, I mean, obviously the textures are really wonderful anyway, but then you get that like beautiful glow. And then some more Ed Fella work. So another project that Ed Fella is sort of famous for is these books of Polaroids of, there's not just type, but there's quite a bit of type. And basically he just shoots hundreds of Polaroids and then tapes them into compositions. So this one loosely has a theme of like blue, but there's also, he's sort of making interesting pictures to begin with. Like he's not really interested in documenting type. Like it's not like he goes, oh, it's a cool sign, and takes a picture. It's more like he goes, I feel like taking a picture, and then he's sort of moving it around until he's got a composition he's interested in. But then on top of that, he starts kind of jamming them together to see how maybe like this form flows into here. This shape echoes this arrow, or the white space sort of continues in here. And then one of the things that ends up happening is that this stuff will start to show up in those flyers as well. So that all of a sudden it's like, well, this is kind of interesting. And then maybe like make a sketch based on this weird kind of accident, or a sketch based on this, whatever it is I'm even looking at. Can't even tell. And then looking at some really old stuff, this is an advertisement by Franco Grignani, who was an Italian designer who was really influenced by, I wouldn't even say influenced, I'd say he was an op artist. So like working with optical illusions. And the way that translated into his typography was that he would make these insane sort of darkroom experiments with the type, which is interesting because he also was like kind of a very buttoned up like Swiss style designer at the same time. So you can see like how very clear this is, but then like this wonderful expressive distorted type. It's like it's floating on water. This is another Grignani piece. I can't even tell. I guess we have like a ampersandy kind of thing, just this sort of interesting visual anchor. Oh, it's probably the logo for Alfieri and Lacroix. So a lot of times he's like distorting the type just to make an interesting image, just to get your attention. Another example of that. I'd love to see like the raw material for one of these. Like, what does the actual thing look like? Is it all crumpled up, or is it like a transparency that's like being bent, or what? And then this is one more. It's kind of interesting. It's a very different take by Grignani, which is that it still has this sort of distorted type, but now it's happening by ripping and tearing into it. It's interesting. It's a little bit earlier. And then the last little chunk of stuff is modified or layered. So digital manipulation and composition. So this is a poster by Gail Swanland and Jeff Kaplan, which is like for a conference or something. What's interesting is it's really hard to find work that looks like this now. So this is from 1998. And like graphic design is like going through a really kind of clear phase at the moment. So finding stuff that's sort of layered and a little bit like where they're messing with the type is pretty unusual. But basically they're going in and like building out this sort of structure of type and then drawing into it and cutting out of it and just sort of pushing some of these letters to the point where they're not quite legible, but based on like this S is getting pretty chopped away, but based on just the surroundings, you can tell that there's still a word there. And so now like it becomes intriguing as you sort of chop away at it, but it also does things where it makes these really nice kind of negative shapes too. Like I feel like this area right in here is just lovely. And then this is a spread from a book by the British design firm called Tomato. The book was called Skyscraper, I Love You. And it's basically probably a 128-page book that's like a typographic interpretation of New York City. The members of Tomato were also in the band Underworld, and they recorded, I can't remember what record, they recorded, I think, their first full album in New York. So bunch of Englishmen in New York, and they basically sort of composed this love letter to the city that attempts to like interpret the textures and the density of it. Here's another spread from it. This one's actually a crop. It's not the right proportions. Whoever scanned it chopped off a piece of it, but you get a pretty nice thing. This is a little bit more accurate. There's a lot of like very active kind of negative space happening. And this is a poster by David Carson from 1995. And Carson's probably like the most famous, well, it's probably still one of the most famous graphic designers, but he was really famous in the 90s for like the super layered, like textural, painterly approach to graphic design. Like you're not gonna look at this and be able, like the tomato stuff or tomato, you can kind of look at it and once you know it's about skyscrapers in New York, you're like, yeah, I see that. With Carson, especially at this point, you're not really going to dig out a kind of verbal concept in that way. It's much more of like, oh, it looks interesting when I switch from like, when I line up this future A with this, whatever this is, accidents, grotesque R, and like, there's something kind of cool happening when this gets smaller than this, and then sort of just throwing type around. So it's really like making a painting with the type. And then this was a spread from Ray Gun, which was a magazine that Carson designed in the 90s. And again, there's this sort of just like painting with the type, like sort of throwing it around and like letting the textures do interesting things. There's also like a kind of interesting sense of experimentation, like the fact that he's purposely lining up indents with basically the ends of other paragraphs, which is probably maddening to read, but it sure looks nice in a slide. And then this is some work by Non-Format, who half of Non-Format is actually out of St. Paul. The other half is in Norway. But one of the things that they are very interesting because they also sort of work with the idea of like a pure investigation of form. Like they're known for just making things and having sort of flat files filled with work that they don't show people, that they just make it to make it. And then once they sort of hit upon something they're interested in, then all of a sudden all their work for every client will look like that for 6 months to a year. And then once they've like gotten bored with it, it's like they'll dig the next style out and start giving that to all their clients. So they'll go through these things where like whether it's an artist or Nike, their work looks the same. So it's a very kind of iterative process. But in here, they're exploring, they have a lot of Japanese clients, and they're making this typeface that attempts to read in English, but like work well with Japanese characters. And so, so they're doing these sort of investigations of like how far they can break down their type. And then at the same time, they're also doing these sort of like typographic sculptures, which I don't know if that looks pretty real, but it could just be a 3D rendering. And then this is another bit of Non-Format. So they design typeface. Oh, obviously they design typefaces. I just said that. But here's another typeface that they designed called Merlin that was specifically designed for a book of an artist's work. And they're like, they conduct these sort of beautiful experiments of trying to like figure out what can be subtracted from a typeface and like what can a line be besides a straight line. And then on this side, we actually see this typeface now gets turned into this almost like painterly element. So it's readable, like we can read that it says JFK and LAX, but then at the same time, it lends itself to this really beautiful positive, negative shapes. Even when it's just like typeset normally, it looks like it's doing weirdo kind of interesting stuff. Let's see. That's how we can stalk me. Cool. So that is 15 minutes or so of typographic expressionism.
What was the designer's name that did the restaurant?
That was Neasden Control Centre. And I can go back to that. So there we go. And there's actually a ton of work on their website for this project, and I had to force myself to be restrained so that we could make stuff. Okay, so